On January 16, 1917, a sealed German dispatch slipped into the Atlantic and vanished without a trace. Its contents would have offered Mexico a pact to seize Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, but Britain's Room 40 never cracked it. In reality, British cryptographers decoded the Zimmermann telegram on February 24, exposing Germany's gamble and pushing the United States toward war. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The world in early 1917 was already a tinderbox. The Great War had raged since July 1914 after Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination ignited a cascade of alliances. By February, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, hoping to starve Britain into surrender before American industry could tip the balance. President Woodrow Wilson had won re-election in November 1916 on a platform of strict neutrality, and the United States was still officially an observer, trading with both sides while keeping its troops at home. But a single uncaught message would set off a chain of events that reshaped North America and tipped the European balance toward a German victory. What if the telegram had never been intercepted? How far could Germany's promise of Mexican reclamation stretch before it collided with the realities of a continent already torn by revolution? With Room 40 blind to the German overture, the telegram reached Berlin's foreign ministry and was promptly forwarded to the German ambassador in Mexico City. On March 30, 1917, Ambassador Karl von Stürmer met with General Álvaro Obregón and revolutionary leader Venustiano Carranza, offering a formal alliance. Germany would supply arms, advisors, and financial backing if Mexico launched a coordinated campaign to reclaim its former northern territories. Mexico's internal war, its revolution, had already fractured the nation into competing factions, yet both Obregón and Carranza saw an opportunity. The promise of German rifles, artillery, and even a few early Zeppelins could tip the balance against rival caudillos and provide leverage to settle long-standing grievances over lost lands. The Germans, for their part, calculated that a Mexican front would distract the United States, keeping American troops from Europe while opening a new theater where they could test experimental weapons. The pact remained secret, known only to a handful of diplomats, military officers, and a few journalists in Berlin, who dismissed it as a wild diplomatic gamble. An open loop now emerges. If Mexico mobilized under German auspices, would the United States remain indifferent, or would the specter of a revived confederacy awaken dormant anxieties along the border? By late spring, German shipments began arriving in Mexican ports, arms hidden among coal cargoes, engineers disguised as civilian contractors. In June 1917, Mexican forces assembled near the Rio Grande, preparing for an incursion into Texas. Meanwhile, Wilson's administration, still bound by its neutrality pledge, dismissed reports of German-Mexican cooperation as propaganda from the Central Powers. The first clash occurred on July 4, 1917, when a small contingent of Mexican irregulars crossed at Brownsville, aiming to seize the city and ignite local support. American troops stationed at Fort Sam Houston responded swiftly, repelling the attack but suffering casualties that sent shockwaves through the press. The incident was reported as a rogue band of outlaws, yet the image of a foreign army marching under the Mexican flag toward U.S. soil ignited public outrage. Behind the scenes, Wilson faced a dilemma. He could invoke his 1917 war powers and declare an emergency, but doing so would betray his campaign promise and risk alienating isolationist voters in the Midwest. The president opted for a measured response. He authorized a limited mobilization of National Guard units along the border, while ordering diplomatic protests to Berlin and Mexico City. This hesitation created another loop. Would the United States eventually be forced into war by a protracted Mexican offensive, or could diplomatic pressure contain the conflict long enough for Europe's tides to turn? The summer of 1917 saw a series of skirmishes along the border. Mexican forces, bolstered by German artillery and early aircraft, managed to capture El Paso in August, prompting a fierce American counter-offensive that reclaimed the city by September. Each side suffered mounting losses, and civilian populations on both sides endured displacement and hardship. In Washington, Wilson's cabinet grew restless. Secretary of State Robert Lansing warned that continued German influence in Mexico could destabilize the entire continent, potentially drawing Canada and Caribbean colonies into a wider conflict. Yet the president clung to his principle: we shall be the world's conscience, not its sword. Across the Atlantic, Germany celebrated the distraction. With American troops still confined to North America, the Western Front saw an intensified German push at Verdun and the Somme in late 1917. The Allies, already strained by the British blockade and Russian upheaval, found their reserves stretched thin. A third open loop forms. As the European stalemate deepens, could a decisive breakthrough on either side finally break the deadlock, or would the war grind into an endless attrition that reshapes political orders worldwide? In early 1918, the German High Command launched Operation Kaiserschlag, a massive spring offensive aimed at breaking through Allied lines before American forces could be fully deployed. Historically, this offensive faltered due to logistical failures and fresh U.S. troops. In our alternate timeline, however, the United States still had only a modest expeditionary force, approximately 50,000 men, still training in camps near the border. Without substantial American reinforcement, German stormtroopers achieved breakthroughs at Amiens and Saint-Quentin. The Allies, exhausted from years of trench warfare and now facing a revitalized German army, began negotiating armistice terms that favored the Central Powers. By November 1918, an armistice was signed not in the fields of France, but in a Berlin conference room, granting Germany control over Belgium, large parts of France's industrial north, and a sphere of influence extending into Eastern Europe. The consequences rippled back across the Atlantic. With a German victory cemented, Berlin intensified its support for Mexico, sending more advisors and even a squadron of Zeppelins to conduct reconnaissance over the southwest. The United States, now isolated diplomatically, faced an impossible choice: continue a costly border war alone or seek a negotiated settlement with Germany. Emboldened by their European allies' triumph, Mexican forces launched a renewed offensive in early 1919, this time targeting the strategic rail hub of El Paso and pushing northward toward Albuquerque. German engineers helped construct fortified positions along the Rio Grande, while Zeppelins provided aerial bombardment that devastated supply lines. The United States responded by invoking the War Powers Act for the first time since the Civil War, authorizing a full mobilization of the regular Army and National Guard. By mid-1919, over 200,000 American troops were deployed along the border, supported by artillery and early tanks shipped from domestic factories now operating at wartime capacity. The fighting grew brutal. Towns changed hands repeatedly, civilian casualties mounted. International observers, including a weary British delegation, condemned the conflict as a forgotten war that threatened to destabilize the entire Western Hemisphere. Yet no major power intervened. Europe was preoccupied with redrawing maps after Germany's victory, and Russia remained embroiled in civil war. By late 1920, both sides were exhausted. The Mexican Revolution itself had fractured further under the strain of a foreign-backed campaign, while the United States faced mounting political pressure from anti-war factions demanding an end to the bloodshed. Secret negotiations began in neutral Switzerland, mediated by Swiss diplomats and a few French officials still hoping to preserve some influence in Europe. The resulting treaty, known as the Rio Grande Accord, established a demilitarized buffer zone along the current border, ceded limited territories in West Texas, including Laredo, to Mexico under conditional German oversight, and stipulated that any further disputes would be settled by an international commission headquartered in Geneva. In exchange, Germany agreed to withdraw all direct military assistance to Mexico and recognize U.S. sovereignty over the remaining United States territory. The accord left a scarred landscape, towns divided by new borders, families split, economies shattered. Yet it also prevented a full-scale continental war and forced both nations to reckon with the consequences of their earlier choices. What if the Zimmermann telegram had been intercepted as it was in our world? The United States would have entered World War I in April 1917, bolstering the Allies and likely hastening Germany's defeat. The Mexican Revolution would have continued without external German backing, and the North American border would have remained largely unchanged. In this alternate timeline, a missed cipher allowed Germany to leverage a distant ally, delay US involvement, and ultimately secure a victory that reshaped Europe and forced America into an unforeseen continental conflict. It underscores how a single piece of intelligence or its absence can reverberate across continents, altering destinies far beyond the original intent. The story reminds us that history is not merely a chain of inevitable events, but a fragile web where hidden messages, secret agreements, and the choices of individuals can pivot entire societies onto new trajectories. As we look back at the real Zimmermann telegram, we see it as both a warning and a turning point, a moment when the world chose one path over another, sparing us from the alternate darkness we have just imagined.